Hey there. I want to spend a little bit of time today introducing you to your AP World History textbook. I think this is going to become at least one of your three best friends for the next couple of months, and so it's time to start getting to know this book. You are going to be responsible for spending a bunch of time this year with a book called Ways of the World, A Brief Global History by Robert W. Strayer, my close personal friend. You might get the second edition, you might get the third edition, you might get the fourth edition. The PDFs of the second edition are available on Google Classroom. Later in February, you will have an opportunity to pick up a hard copy. It looks like this. It's really nice to just hold when you're uncomfortable about the state of the world. You should be able to pick a copy of that up from the school in late February if you prefer to use a hard copy, which I really recommend. But either way, you're going to be responsible for reading big chunks of this textbook. Robert W. Strayer is the author. He is charming and adorable and occasionally pops up on Facebook to just encourage AP World History teachers around the country, and I find that really sweet. I prefer to think of him pictured here on vacation wearing a fun shirt. I talk a lot about Robert Strayer. I've never met him and I probably never will, but that's okay. We're all going to engage in this fiction together. Um, Oh, also worth mentioning that there is a Robert Strayer fan Twitter, and the less said about that, the better. So, you're gonna, I think perhaps when I hand you a giant textbook or ask you to read, 20 or 30 pages at a time, I think your initial reaction would be understandably negative. Teaching from the textbook gets a lot of bad press in education circles, and that's understandable and sometimes justified. But there's a couple reasons why I think it's important for us to use a textbook regardless. Number one, this is the primary source of factual information. We can do a lot more, a lot faster, a lot more efficiently, and have a lot more, dare I say, fun in this class if you come to class with factual information already in your head. And so using that textbook is a good place to get the basic facts of what happened in history so that you can come to class equipped to talk about the more interesting, analytical, critical things that we have to say about history. Number two, this textbook ensures broad coverage. I have a really limited amount of class time with you. That's especially true in the spring semester. And so there are going to be some things that you read in the textbook that we're not going to talk about in class. And so the textbook serves as a stopgap so that there's going to be some important things that I don't have time to talk with you about directly. But if you read the textbook thoroughly and thoughtfully, you will have a broader understanding of world history, and you might find something that strikes your interest that I wouldn't have otherwise included in my day-to-day lessons. Number three, the textbook itself is worth criticizing and interrogating and thinking deeply about. Even textbooks have biases, even though they try to be objective. Everybody has some sort of bias. Everybody is selling you some sort of argument or interpretation. And so occasionally we're actually going to use the textbook to step back and evaluate how this particular author is presenting history, what choices he's making when he's doing it, and how you might make different choices in your own presentation of history. The textbook is not the be-all and end-all of the curriculum. It is not the only good presentation of this big picture human history that we do in AP World, but it is an important starting point, and you do need to take it pretty seriously. Let's talk a little bit about the day-to-day how you approach these readings, and I'm using just a screen grab from the first reading that's due this semester. It's titled Reading 1. It's about medieval Europe, and it's the first thing you have to turn in for me from the textbook. So 3 things you need to note about this section of the reading guide, which can be found in Google Classroom and which is linked in your Unit 1 schedule. First, helpfully, it includes the links to the readings if you want to do those in PDF. Alternatively, once you have the hard copy of the textbook, you can look to Chapter 10 and find the appropriate section title. So the link to the reading is right there for you. Number 2, for every reading, I'm going to give you 1 or 2 guiding questions because there's a lot of information in these chunks of the textbook, and I want you to be able to focus your thoughts and focus your note-taking and focus your reading. So I'll give you that guiding question to kind of point you in the direction of the big idea that I'm hoping you'll take away from this reading. You should be able to form a pretty coherent answer to that guiding question once you've finished the reading and the notes. Finally, I'm going to list some key terms at the bottom. Those are specific pieces of vocabulary that you need to know. You're accountable for knowing each of these things. Once you have finished the reading, they're fair game for quizzes, and they're really, really useful if you are writing an essay sometime down the line, and you need to summon some evidence for a specific historical claim. The key terms are really your best starting point for that. You need to have those key terms defined and highlighted in some way in your reading. Please make sure that when I'm grading your reading notes, I can skim through and find each and every key term that's listed in that section of the reading guide. The first thing you're going to need to do when you sit down to do one of these reading assignments is figure out exactly what you're going to read. And so let me walk you through a couple features of the way that this textbook is laid out so that you can figure out what you have to do more quickly. First thing you want to note is that if you look at the first page of any given chapter, there will be a big pretty picture, and then you will see a chapter outline. This gives you all of the sections and subsections that are going to show up in the chapter. Sometimes I'm going to assign you to read an entire chapter and you just want to skim this so you know where you're going. I find it easier to absorb readings if I have a general sense of where the thing is headed. Sometimes I'm just going to assign you a single one or two sections of a chapter. And when that's the case, you want to skim down this chapter outline so you can see how far through the chapter to go before you find the section that you're supposed to read. The other thing you'll notice on this first page of text in the chapter is that there's a little vignette or scene or story, often trying to connect something in the present day to the history that you're supposed to be reading about in this chapter. You can skim that if it interests you. You can skip it if you want. It's not specific historical information, but it might be a good way of tying the world you know about into the world that you're learning about. So if I flip through these pages until I get to the section that I'm supposed to read for reading 1, which is titled Western Christendom, just want to orient you to the layout here so you know exactly how much you need to read. These large purple headings are the titles of sections. There's generally 4 or 5 or 6 sections per chapter, and I will pretty much always assign you a full section to read. That's almost always the minimum length of reading that I'm asking you to do. Within each section, you'll see several of these smaller blue headers. Those are subsections. So I'm just telling you this because I don't want you to think that when I assign you to read Western Christendom, Rebuilding in the Wake of the Roman Collapse, that all you have to read is this paragraph. You should read from the title of the section that you've been assigned through the next big purple section title. So please do watch out for that. And I also, by the way, give you an estimated number of pages at the start of every reading so that you know that if what you've done is drastically shorter than what it says it is, you might want to go back and check that you've actually read the entire section. A couple other things to point out in the name of giving you less work and not more. Number one, in the margins, Strayer puts occasionally these analytical questions. Sometimes they're about change, sometimes they're about comparison, sometimes they're about interpretation. You can use those or not, but if you're trying to figure out exactly what to do with how to focus your reading for a given subsection, you're welcome to use those, and you're welcome to use those to try and review after you've done the readings as well. In addition, once or twice per chapter, you're going to see these kind of yellow boxes inserted into the text. Sometimes they'll tell you about a specific event, sometimes they'll be about a specific person, sometimes they'll be about a specific document or artifact. Those are optional. They're often interesting. In particular, Strayer really throws a lot of the most interesting women in world history into those yellow boxes, and I recommend that you read that. But they're totally optional, and I'm not going to examine you on them unless I tell you otherwise. Last thing, when you get about 2/3 of the way through the PDF for any given chapter, you'll see this page that says documents, and then you'll see like 15 or 20 pages of primary source documents. Sometimes you'll also see art or other pieces of visual artifacts. You don't have to read those. Please don't take notes on the entire thing. Again, if you want to read those, I'm certainly not going to stop you. But please don't feel compelled if I give you an entire chapter to read the document section. It's never part of your assignment. Okay, so you have figured out now what it is that you need to read. I want to talk a little bit now about how to take notes because as much as I would like to, I can't read your mind, and I need some physical evidence that you've done the reading in order to give you credit for this work. So, there's a bunch of different note-taking formats. You, at this point in your education, hopefully have one or two that you're familiar and comfortable with. But whatever note-taking format you want to use, you really should, it needs to meet, in order to earn credit in this class, 5 criteria, which are as follows. These, by the way, are also outlined at the top of your reading guide. Number one, your notes need to be in your own words. There's not really a way around that. If you really like a turn of phrase that Strayer used, or if he's quoted some primary source document and you want that quote, just make it really clear in that document that that's Strayer's words or that's a primary source's words. Use quotation marks, but the majority of your notes need to be in your own words. That way you're doing something with the information as you're reading rather than just copying it down. There is no point whatsoever to copying out the textbook by hand. Number two, your notes need to be hierarchically organized. It should not just be a blob of text. It should not just be a straight list of bullet points. You need to indicate visually in some way that you are distinguishing between big topics and smaller details in your notes. And I'll talk in a little bit, and we'll talk in class about some formats that really lend themselves to hierarchical organization. But you absolutely must distinguish between big picture and smaller details. Number three, your notes have to be narrative, and I'm mostly telling you this if you took CompGov with me at some point in your past, and you think that the way to take notes is lists of vocabulary. I will tell you right now, I have a lot of former CompGov students who turn in lists of vocabulary for AP World Notes and never get full credit. So please make sure that you're capturing the historical narrative, the sequence of events, those arguments about causation and comparison and continuity and change. That needs to happen. It can't just be a list of definitions of the he terms. Number four, your notes need to strike a balance between you don't want to capture the entire chapter because otherwise there's no point. You could just copy it out by hand, but you also need enough detail. Right? If your notes don't include every key term, if your notes don't sufficiently answer the guiding question, they're probably not detailed enough. On the other hand, if your notes are about as long as the chapter, they're probably way too detailed. We'll talk about this. There's not a single rule that's going to be foolproof in terms of getting you to the right level of detail. And so I'll give you pretty extensive feedback on your first few sets of notes until we get to a point at which you're taking enough notes, but not too many notes. But you want to be somewhere between just very loosely summarizing the chapter and repeating every single detail in the chapter. Finally, your notes need to be written by hand. This is the single least popular thing about the first week of my course. I no longer feel that bad about it, and I promise that there are some pedagogical reasons for it, which I'm happy to talk to you about if you're interested. But just know for now that I do not accept typewritten notes unless we have some sort of prior written agreement, and I don't think that I have ever made that exception for a student in this course. So just so I can say that I told you so, please don't give me typed notes. They have to be written by hand. 2 formats in which your notes are likely to end up. There's other formats that might work for you. If you have something else, feel free to run it by me before turning in your first set of notes so we can talk about whether it's going to be detailed enough to earn credit from me. But most of my students end up taking notes either in the form of outline notes, which you see on the left, or Cornell notes, which you see on the right. You're probably familiar with one or both of those formats already. If you're not, there's some links in the first page of the reading guide that will help walk you through the process of how to take these notes. But these tend to be the 2 best ways of taking notes for the purposes of reading this particular history textbook. And we'll talk more about that in class. Once you've done your reading, once you have taken your notes, once you have double-checked that all your key terms are included and so on and so forth, there are 2 more things to do to ensure that you earn full credit as a homework assignment. Number one, please take a photo of your notes or run it through a scanner if that's something you have available to you, and upload them to the relevant assignment in Google Classroom. For every assignment, there will be an assignment in Classroom titled Reading 1 Notes, Reading 2 Notes, etc., etc. I'm not super creative about that. The links are always going to be in the unit schedule. And so you need to upload and submit those notes, those photos of your notes, before the start of class on the day when the reading is due. It makes my life a lot easier if you can get those photos to be in a single document. If you just paste them in order into a Google Doc or something like that. Do that if you can. Don't stress out if it's difficult for you. Number two thing that you need to do also before the start of class is to take the quiz. I grade these quizzes for completion. You do not need to worry about going back and correcting your answers, and I would actually recommend that you try and do them without notes, without looking up things in the textbook or on Google. But the quiz is there just as a way for you to check your own understanding. As a general rule, if you're getting all those questions right on the quiz, it means that you have a pretty decent level of understanding of what I think are some of the most important points in the reading. So please make sure that you do all three of those things, that you do the reading, that you upload photos of your notes, and that you submit that quiz graded for completion before the start of class on any given day. That's how you can maximize your credit for these assignments. Last thing I'll say, this is a really dense textbook. It's not always super fun. As much as I love Robert Strayer, it is not always going to be like a page-turning read that will keep you up at night in a good way. And if you need help managing the workload here, especially if we get a couple weeks into this course and these assignments are taking you more than a couple of hours, please, please, please ask for help. You can sign up for office hours. You can shoot me an email. You can take a look at any of those resources that I've posted in the reading guide. There's lots of techniques that I can try in order to make these notes work for you, but you have to let me know if you're having difficulty with them. So please don't hesitate to reach out if these notes are taking a really long time or if they're otherwise causing you an undue amount of stress. That's it. We'll talk more about this in class when I see you next. Thanks very much.